The grand hall was filled with the soft sound of people talking, clinking glasses, and expensive laughter. It was the biggest night of the year for the city's music lovers. Everyone who was anyone was there, dressed in their finest clothes. The chandeliers hanging from the ceiling were brighter than stars, lighting up the gold and white decorations. In the middle of all this richness and happiness walked a young woman named Elena. She didn't look like the others. She wore a simple, dark blue dress that didn't have any famous designer label on it. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and she carried a black violin case by her side. She held it tightly, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. As Elena walked through the large wooden doors, the atmosphere seemed to change. The room felt colder. People stopped talking for a second to look at her. It wasn't because they were happy to see her. It was because they were surprised. Elena used to be the star of this world. She was the kind of musician who could make people cry with just a few notes. But 5 years ago, she disappeared. There were rumors, whispers in the newspapers, and a big court fight with her old teacher, the famous maestro Victor. Everyone thought she had left the country or given up music forever. Seeing her here tonight was a shock to them all. Elena kept her head up. She looked straight ahead, trying to ignore the eyes that were watching her every move. She could feel their judgment. Some people looked at her with pity, while others looked with smug smiles. They thought she had failed. They believed the stories that Victor had spread about her, that she wasn't talented enough, that she was difficult, and that she had run away because she couldn't handle the pressure. But they didn't know the real story. They didn't know how hard Victor had worked to break her spirit. She made her way to a small table in the very back corner of the room. It was far away from the stage where the important people sat. The chair was hard, and the table was wobbly, but she didn't mind. She just wanted to be there to support the cause. The charity gala was raising money for music education in schools, something Elena cared about deeply. She took a deep breath and sat down, placing the violin case gently on the floor next to her feet. She felt a mix of nervousness and strength in her chest. She knew coming here was a risk, but she also knew she had the right to be there. From across the room, a pair of sharp eyes spotted her. Victor was standing near the stage, talking to a group of wealthy donors. He was wearing a tuxedo that looked perfect on him, and he smiled like a king greeting his subjects. But when he saw Elena, his smile froze. His eyes narrowed, and his jaw tightened. He looked like a predator that had just spotted its prey. For 5 years, he had enjoyed being the victim of the story. He told everyone that Elena had betrayed him and that he was the one who had made her great. Seeing her here threatened his control. Victor excused himself from the group. He began to walk toward the stage, but his mind was racing. He didn't want her here. This was his night. He was the one being honored for his lifetime contribution to the arts. If Elena spoke to anyone, or if people started to remember how good she really was, his carefully built life could fall apart. He needed to do something. He needed to remind everyone who was in charge. He wasn't going to ask her to leave, that would look bad. Instead, he decided he would use her to make himself look even better. The lights in the hall began to dim. The chatter of the crowd faded away as the master of ceremonies walked onto the stage. He welcomed everyone and started a long speech about the history of the academy. Elena sat quietly in the dark corner. She watched the faces of the people around her. They were eager for the entertainment to begin. She thought about leaving. Her heart was beating fast, and her hands felt a little sweaty. Why had she come, she asked herself. Was it to prove she wasn't afraid, or was it because she missed the music then, The master of ceremonies introduced the man of the hour. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the legendary Victor Vance." The room erupted in applause. Victor walked onto the stage with a confident stride. He bowed deeply, soaking in the admiration. He shook hands with the MC and took his place behind the podium. He adjusted the microphone and looked out over the sea of people. He waited for the applause to die down before he spoke. "Thank you," Victor said, his voice smooth and commanding. "Tonight is not just about me. It is about music. It is about the discipline it takes to create beauty." He paused for effect. "Many of you know the struggles I have faced. The students who take your generosity and waste it. The ones who think talent is enough, but who lack the character to succeed." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. She knew he was talking about her. He always did this in his speeches, hinting at his past troubles without naming names, letting the audience fill in the blanks. She gripped the edge of the table. Victor continued, "But I am a forgiving man. I believe in second chances. In fact, I see someone in the audience tonight who I tried to help many years ago. Someone who perhaps lost their way." The spotlight moved. It swept across the front rows, illuminating surprised faces, and then it swung toward the back of the room. The bright white light hit Elena's table. She squinted, shielding her eyes. The room went dead silent. Everyone turned their heads to look at the woman in the simple dress. The whispers started immediately. "Is that her?" someone whispered loudly. "I thought she left town." "Victor is pointing at her." Victor smiled from the stage. He could see the fear and discomfort on Elena's face, and it pleased him. He thought he had the upper hand. He thought she would shrink away, or maybe even run out of the room in shame. He gestured for her to stand up. "Please, stand up, Elena," Victor's voice boomed through the speakers. It wasn't a request, it was an order disguised as a kindness. "Don't be shy. We would all love to see you." Elena's legs felt heavy. The heat of hundreds of stairs was burning her skin. She knew this was a trap. If she stayed seated, she looked rude. If she stood up, she was playing his game. But looking at Victor's smug face, something inside her shifted. She realized that hiding was what he wanted. He wanted her to feel small. So, she decided she wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Slowly, Elena pushed her chair back. The legs scraped loudly against the floor, echoing in the silent room. She stood up, brushing the creases out of her dress. She lifted her chin and looked directly at the blinding spotlight, refusing to look down at the floor. She didn't look at Victor. She just looked into the light, showing everyone that she was not ashamed. A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. They were surprised by her posture. She didn't look like a guilty person, she looked strong. "Wonderful," Victor said, though his tone dripped with sarcasm. "You see, folks, sometimes students come back. Sometimes they realize they made a mistake." He paused, looking at her like a strict father looking at a naughty child. "We have a special tradition here. On this night, we celebrate music. Elena, why don't you come up to the stage? Perhaps you can show us what you have been doing all these years, or maybe, just maybe, you might want to apologize to the people who supported your education before you walked away." The crowd gasped. It was a brutal public attack. He was putting her on the spot in front of the most powerful people in the city. He expected her to crumble. He expected her to cry or stutter. The pressure was immense. Elena looked at her violin case on the floor. This was the moment. Everything in her life had led to this terrible, Wonderful moment. She took a deep breath, reached down, and picked up the case. She walked toward the stage, her heels clicking on the hard floor. The crowd parted to let her through, like the Red Sea, but their eyes were wide with anticipation of a disaster. They were waiting for the humiliation, but they had no idea what Elena was about to do. The walk to the stage felt like the longest journey Elena had ever taken. Every step was heavy, and the sound of her heels clicking against the polished wooden floor seemed to echo in the silence of the room. She could feel hundreds of eyes burning into her back. The guests were no longer whispering, they were staring openly, their faces filled with curiosity and judgment. Some of them held their drinks halfway to their mouths, frozen in place, waiting to see what would happen next. It felt like a dream where you try to run but your legs won't move fast enough, only this was real, and there was nowhere to hide. As she climbed the stairs to the platform, the lights became even brighter. The heat from the spotlights was intense, making her face feel hot. Up close, the stage looked massive and empty, except for the podium where Victor stood. He was smiling, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile a wolf gives to a sheep before it moves in for the attack. He looked tall and powerful in his tuxedo, while Elena felt small in her simple blue dress. She gripped the handle of her violin case so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She knew exactly what he was trying to do. He wanted to scare her. He wanted to remind everyone that he was the master and she was just the student who had failed. When she finally reached the center of the stage, the master of ceremonies stepped forward. He looked nervous, glancing quickly at Victor and then at Elena. He held out a stack of papers. It was the sheet music for the performance. "Here is the piece," the man mumbled, avoiding eye contact with her. Mr. Vance thought it would be appropriate. Elena took the papers. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from anger. She looked down at the title of the song. It was one of Victor's most famous compositions, called The Storm. It was a piece of music known for being incredibly fast and difficult. It was the kind of song that required absolute perfection. If you missed one note, everyone would hear it. Victor knew this. He had picked this song on purpose. He wanted to set her up for failure. He wanted the world to see that she wasn't as good as he was, or perhaps he wanted to see if she would panic and run away in front of everyone. She looked closer at the notes. Her eyes, trained by years of reading music, scanned the page quickly. Something was wrong. The notes looked strange. The key signatures had been changed in places where they shouldn't be. The tempo markings were erratic, jumping from very slow to incredibly fast in a way that made no musical sense. It was a trap. This wasn't just the original difficult piece, it was a sabotaged version. It was designed to be technically impossible to play correctly. If she tried to play it as written, it would sound horrible. It would sound like a screeching mess. Victor hadn't just invited her up to play, he had handed her a loaded gun, expecting her to shoot herself in the foot. Elena looked up at Victor. He was watching her closely, enjoying her confusion. He leaned in close to the microphone, his voice booming through the hall. "Do you remember this one, Elena? It was one of the first pieces I taught you." "Of course, that was a long time ago. I'm sure your skills might be a bit rusty after all this time. Don't worry about being perfect. Just do your best." The crowd chuckled softly. It was a cruel laugh. They believed him. They thought she was washed up, a has-been who had been working a normal job for 5 years. They expected her to struggle, they were waiting for the mistake. The pressure in the room was suffocating. A normal person would have crumbled. A normal person would have dropped the music, apologized, and run off the stage in tears. But Elena wasn't that person anymore. She had spent the last 5 years surviving on her own. She had faced tough times and hard work. She had learned that the only person she could rely on was herself. She stood straighter. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the warm, dusty air of the stage. She looked out at the audience. The bright lights made it hard to see their faces clearly, but she could feel the energy rolling off them like a wave. It was a mix of anticipation and cruelty. They wanted a show. They wanted drama. Victor wanted a humiliation. Fine, Elena thought to herself. You want a show, I'll give you a show. She turned her attention to the orchestra members sitting in the pit in front of the stage. They were tuning their instruments, chatting quietly. They didn't know what was coming either. The conductor, a friend of Victor's, looked at her with a bored expression. He raised his baton, ready to start. He didn't care about her, he just wanted to get this over with. Elena walked over to a small music stand center stage. She placed the sabotaged papers on it. She looked at them one last time, memorizing the chaos written on the page. Then, she calmly opened her violin case. The click of the latches opening was the only sound in the vast hall. She lifted out her violin. It was an old instrument, made of dark, aged wood that had turned a deep amber color over the years. It didn't look flashy or expensive, but it had a voice that could sing like an angel. She tightened the bow, rubbing the rosin over the horsehair. It was a ritual she had done 1,000 times, a comforting routine that calmed her racing heart. As she handled the instrument, the tension in her shoulders began to melt away. The violin felt like an extension of her body. It felt like coming home. All the anxiety, all the judgment, all the noise of the crowd faded into the background. For a moment, it was just her and the music. She tucked the violin under her chin and positioned the bow on the strings. She looked at the conductor. He raised his baton high. The audience held its collective breath. Victor stood with his arms crossed, a smirk plastered on his face, waiting for the disaster to begin. The conductor brought his baton down. The orchestra erupted into sound. They were playing the introduction loudly and aggressively, trying to overpower her before she even started. It was another trick. They were playing at a tempo much faster than the standard version, trying to make her stumble right out of the gate. The music swelled around her, a wall of noise designed to drown her out. It was loud and chaotic. Elena closed her eyes for a split second. She blocked out the sound of the orchestra. She ignored the fake sheet music in front of her. She didn't move her bow. She stood perfectly still in the middle of the storm, a statue of calm amidst the noise. The conductor glanced at Victor, confused. Victor's smirk faltered slightly. Why wasn't she playing then? Elena opened her eyes. She didn't look at the music stand. She didn't look at Victor. She looked directly at the sound technician in the back of the room. She made a sharp, cutting motion across her throat with her hand. The technician blinked. He didn't know what to do. He looked at Victor, but Victor was busy staring at Elena. The technician hesitated for a heartbeat. Then, thinking maybe there was a technical issue or perhaps just following the strong command of the musician on stage, he hit a switch. Suddenly, the microphones for the entire orchestra cut out. The loud, crashing noise of the instruments vanished instantly, reduced to a dull, acoustic echo in the distance. But Elena's microphone was still on. The silence that followed was shocking. It was as if someone had pulled a plug out of the wall. The audience gasped. The conductor waved his arms, but no sound came out. The musicians looked around, confused. Victor stepped forward from the podium, his face turning a shade of angry red. He opened his mouth to yell or to order the technician to turn the sound back on. But it was too late. Elena had already taken control. She raised her bow, and without waiting for anyone, without counting to 4, she began to play. The sudden silence in the room was heavier than the loud music that had filled it just a moment before. It was the kind of silence that makes your ears ring, a vacuum where no one dared to breathe. The conductor was frozen in the middle of the orchestra pit, his arms still raised in mid-air, looking like a statue that had stopped moving. He stared at the musicians, and the musicians stared back, their instruments resting on their laps. They were confused. They could hear themselves playing, naturally, but the crowd couldn't. It felt like they had been cut off from the world. All the power and noise they had used to try and drown Elena out had vanished into thin air. The only sound left in the entire massive hall came from the small amplifier attached to Elena's microphone. Victor took a sharp step forward, his hand moving toward the microphone on his podium. He looked furious. His face, usually calm and collected, was twisted in shock and anger. He was not in control anymore. This was not part of his plan. He had expected Elena to stand there, looking foolish, trying to play along with the difficult tempo of the orchestra. He had expected her to fail musically. But by cutting off the sound of the orchestra, she had changed the game completely. She had stripped away his shield. Now, it was just her against the silence. Elena didn't look at him. She didn't look at the confused conductor or the wealthy people sitting in the front row. She focused entirely on the fingerboard of her violin. She didn't play the notes that were written on the sheet music sitting on the stand in front of her. She didn't play the storm. Instead, she started with a single, low note. It was a deep, vibrating sound that seemed to come from the bottom of her heart. The note hung in the air, trembling slightly, full of a sadness that everyone in the room could feel. The audience leaned forward in their seats. The man who had been whispering earlier stopped talking. The woman holding her champagne glass lowered it slowly to the table. Something was happening. They could feel it in their chests. This wasn't the performance they were expecting. This wasn't a technical exercise designed to show off how fast fingers could move. This was something raw. It was human. Elena began to move the bow across the strings. The melody that came out was simple and slow. It was a haunting tune that sounded like a memory. As the first few notes drifted through the room, people stopped looking at Victor and turned their full attention to the woman in the blue dress. The sound was pure and clear. It didn't have the harsh, polished sound of the modern orchestra. It had a soul. It sounded like someone telling a secret they had kept for a very long time. Victor stood behind his podium, gripping the edges so hard his hands shook. He recognized the melody immediately. His eyes went wide with panic. He knew exactly what she was playing. It was the song he had stolen. 5 years ago, he had taken this melody, added drums and trumpets to it, and called it his own masterpiece. He had won awards for it. He had become famous for it. But hearing it now, played simply on a solo violin with no background noise, the truth was impossible to ignore. The complex, flashy version he played was just a mask. This was the real face of the music. Elena played with her eyes closed. She didn't need to see the notes. She had written this melody when she was just a little girl, sitting on the porch of her grandmother's house. She remembered the smell of the rain and the feeling of the cool breeze. She poured all those memories into the instrument. Her left hand moved up and down the neck of the violin with a grace that looked effortless. She wasn't trying to impress anyone with speed. She was trying to make them feel. She made the violin sing, sometimes weeping with a high, piercing note, and other times growling with a deep, low hum. The sound technician in the back of the room watched the monitors. He saw the levels rising and falling with her bowing. He knew he should probably cut her mic, or turn the orchestra back on to stop her, but he couldn't. He was mesmerized. He had never heard a sound like that in this concert hall before. It felt too real, too important to interrupt. On the stage, the conductor finally lowered his arms. He signaled to the musicians to put their instruments down. They could tell that they were no longer needed. In fact, any sound they tried to add would only ruin this moment. They sat there, listening like the rest of the audience. Some of the older musicians wiped tears from their eyes. They knew talent when they heard it. They knew that this was the kind of performance that only happens once in a lifetime. Victor was turning red. He couldn't let this continue. He cleared his throat loudly into his microphone, the harsh sound cracking through the emotion of the music. "Excuse me," he said, his voice shaking. "There seems to be a technical mistake. This is not the agreed-upon program. Please stop." But Elena didn't stop. She didn't even flinch. She opened her eyes, but she didn't look at Victor. She looked out at the crowd. She began to play a variation of the melody, making it stronger, louder, and more aggressive. It was as if she was answering him with the music. The notes became sharper, faster, and more insistent. She was telling the story of her pain. She played the anger she felt when he stole her work. She played the loneliness she felt when she was forced to leave the music world. She played the betrayal. The audience was completely captivated. They could feel the shift in the music. It wasn't just sad anymore, it was powerful. It was like watching a storm build up on the horizon, beautiful but terrifying. People in the front rows looked at Victor, then back at Elena. They were starting to understand. They were starting to realize why she had been gone for so long. The music was explaining everything that words couldn't say. It was obvious that this music belonged to her. No one could play with that much emotion unless they had lived it. Victor looked around the room, panic setting in. He saw the looks on the faces of his donors. They weren't looking at him with respect anymore. They were looking at him with suspicion. He tried to shout into the microphone again, "Security! Someone stop her!" But the security guards at the back of the hall didn't move. They were listening too. The music had cast a spell over the entire room. It was a spell of truth. And in the face of such raw honesty, Victor's power was melting away. He was just a man in a tuxedo shouting at a girl with a violin, and he looked pathetic. Elena reached the climax of the song. She was moving fast now, her hand a blur on the strings. The melody was soaring, rising higher and higher, filling every corner of the massive hall. The sound seemed to bounce off the chandeliers and vibrate through the velvet seats. It was overwhelming. It was beautiful. It was the sound of a soul breaking free. She was proving, without saying a single word, that she was not a failure. She was not a victim. She was the master, and Victor was the fraud. She played the final notes with a strength that resonated deep in the bones of everyone listening, holding the last note until it faded into nothingness, leaving the room breathless and forever changed. As the last, trembling note of Elena's violin faded into the air, the hall remained silent. It was not the polite silence of people waiting for the next thing to happen. It was a heavy, shocked silence that hung over the room like a thick fog. For several long seconds, no one moved. The sounds seemed to echo inside the heads of the audience, bouncing around their memories. The wealthy donors in the front row were still leaning forward, their mouths slightly open, completely stunned. The waiters stood frozen near the walls, holding trays with drinks they had forgotten to serve. Even the musicians in the orchestra pit sat motionless, their instruments resting on their laps, looking up at the woman in the simple blue dress with a mixture of awe and respect. The atmosphere in the room had shifted completely in just a few minutes. When Elena first walked onto the stage, the air had been thick with judgment and cruel anticipation. The crowd had been ready to laugh at her, ready to see Victor prove his superiority. But now, the judgment was gone. In its place was a profound sense of realization. The music had spoken to them in a way that words never could. They had heard the truth in every note she played. It was impossible to fake that kind of emotion. You cannot practice that kind of pain. Even the people who knew nothing about music could feel that they had just witnessed something very special, something very real. Victor stood gripping the sides of his podium, his knuckles white. His face was no longer red with anger, it was pale, drained of all color. He looked small. He looked like a man who had just seen his house of cards collapse in a strong wind. He stared at Elena, but his eyes were wide and darting nervously. He realized with a sinking feeling in his stomach that his plan had backfired completely. He hadn't humiliated her. She had humiliated him, but she hadn't done it with insults or arguments. She had done it by being better than him. She had done it by revealing the hollow nature of his own work. The audience began to look back and forth between Elena and Victor. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together in their minds. They remembered the lawsuit from 5 years ago. Victor had claimed that Elena was difficult, that she was unstable, and that she had tried to steal his work. But hearing her play that melody, the same melody Victor claimed as his masterpiece, made them question everything. If Victor was the genius composer, why had Elena played it with such depth while Victor's own version always felt flashy and empty? Why did her violin seem to weep while his version only seemed to brag? The silence was suddenly broken by a sound from the back of the room. It was the sound of one person clapping. It was slow, rhythmic, and deliberate. Then, another person joined in. Within moments, the sound grew. It wasn't the polite applause that usually happens at these stiff, formal parties. It was a roar. It started as a rumble and then exploded into a wave of noise that shook the chandeliers. People stood up from their seats. They were cheering, not just because the performance was beautiful, but because they knew they had seen an act of bravery. They were clapping for the truth. Elena stood on the stage, the violin still tucked under her chin. She looked out at the sea of standing people. For years, she had been afraid of these people. She had feared their judgment and their power. But looking at them now, she saw that they were just human beings. They had been moved by her honesty. They were cheering for her, not for Victor. The sound was overwhelming, washing over her like a warm ocean wave. She felt a lump form in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She refused to cry. She had cried enough over this man. She was done with tears. Victor tried to regain control. He tapped aggressively on his microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please," he shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "This is highly irregular. This is not the scheduled performance. Please, sit down." But no one listened to him. A few people turned to look at him with annoyed expressions, shushing him. They didn't want to hear his voice anymore. They wanted the moment to last. This made Victor even more panicked. He looked at the master of ceremonies, who was standing off to the side, looking unsure of what to do. Victor waved his hands frantically, signaling for the music to stop or for the curtains to close, but the technicians were enjoying the show too much to help him. He was stranded on his own island, watching his reputation float away. Elena lowered her violin. She reached out and gently turned the music stand around so that the sabotaged sheet music faced the audience. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she took the papers and ripped them in half. The sound of the paper tearing was audible even through the applause. She let the pieces fall to the floor. It was a symbolic gesture. She was rejecting the game he tried to play. She was rejecting the trap he had set for her. She didn't need his permission to play, and she didn't need his approval to be great. The crowd roared even louder at this. They loved the defiance. It was like watching a movie scene where the hero finally defeats the villain. The energy in the room was electric. Cameras flashed from every direction as photographers scrambled to capture the moment. The headlines were already forming in their minds: the return of the prodigy, the maestro exposed, a night of truth. Elena knew she had to leave while she was ahead. She didn't want to stay and listen to Victor make excuses. She didn't want to give him a chance to twist the story later. She had made her point. She had said everything she needed to say. She gently placed her violin back into its case and snapped the latches shut. The sound seemed to signal the end of the performance. She picked up the case, threw the strap over her shoulder, and walked toward the edge of the stage. The conductor, a man who had worked with Victor for years, stood up as she passed. He didn't look at Victor. He looked at Elena. He bowed his head deeply out of respect. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. It was a signal to everyone watching that the professionals knew who the real artist was. Elena gave him a small, sad smile. She appreciated his recognition. She walked down the stairs at the side of the stage. As she reached the floor level, the crowd parted to let her through. This time, they didn't stare at her with curiosity or judgment. They looked at her with admiration. Some people reached out to touch her shoulder as she passed, whispering words of encouragement. "You were amazing," one woman said. "Thank you," an older man whispered. Elena didn't stop to talk. She just kept walking, her head high, moving with a grace and confidence that terrified Victor. Behind her, on the stage, Victor was screaming now. He was yelling at the sound crew, his face purple with rage. But it was too late. The spell was broken. The people had turned against him. His power, which relied entirely on people believing he was the best, was gone. Without his authority, he was nothing. He stood alone on the huge stage, shouting at an empty room that was no longer interested in listening to him. He looked like a child throwing a tantrum while the adults walked away. Elena pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the ballroom and stepped out into the cool night air of the lobby. The noise of the party was muffled behind her. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the fresh air. Her hands were steady now. The shaking was gone. She felt lighter than she had in 5 years. She had walked into that room as a victim, but she was leaving as a victor. She didn't know what would happen tomorrow. She didn't know if Victor would try to sue her again or if the newspapers would believe her. But for tonight, she knew one thing for sure: she had played the truth, and the truth had won. The cool night air hit Elena's face like a splash of cold water, waking her up from the intensity of the last hour. She stood on the top step of the Grand Hotel entrance, looking down at the busy city street. Cars were driving by, their headlights cutting through the darkness, and people were walking their dogs or heading to late dinners. It was strange to think that the rest of the world was continuing as normal while her own world had just been turned upside down inside that ballroom. Behind her, the heavy doors were thick enough to muffle the chaos, but she could still feel the vibration of the noise she had left behind. She didn't run. She didn't rush to a taxi or hide in the shadows. She walked slowly down the stone steps, her heels clicking rhythmically on the pavement. The violin case felt lighter on her shoulder now, as if the instrument itself was relieved to be free of that place. Elena took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the air that smelled of rain and pavement. It was the smell of freedom. For 5 years, she had carried a heavy weight in her chest, the weight of being lied about, of being silenced, and of believing that she wasn't good enough. Tonight, that weight was gone. She had dropped it on the stage along with the sheet music. As she reached the sidewalk, she heard a commotion at the top of the stairs. The heavy doors swung open, and a burst of golden light spilled out onto the street. People were rushing out. It wasn't just the guests leaving early, it was the press. Reporters and photographers who had been inside the gala were now spilling onto the street, shouting into their phones and scrambling for their cameras. They had realized that the real story wasn't the charity dinner. The real story was the woman who had just walked out. Elena didn't look back. She knew that if she stopped, they would swarm her. They would ask her 100 questions at once. They would want to know how she felt, what she was thinking, and what she would do next. But she wasn't ready to talk to them. She didn't need to explain herself with words anymore. The music had said everything that needed to be said. She turned the corner and walked swiftly toward the subway station, blending into the flow of the city crowd. Meanwhile, back inside the hotel ballroom, the atmosphere had turned from awkward to hostile. Victor was still standing on the stage, but the illusion of his power had completely shattered. The applause had died down, replaced by a low, angry murmur that rippled through the crowd like a storm. The wealthy donors were no longer looking at him with admiration. They were looking at him with suspicion and disgust. The master of ceremonies tried to calm the room, but his voice was weak. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, let's continue with our dessert service," he pleaded, but no one was interested in food. From the front row, a man stood up. He was a prominent member of the Arts Council and had been Victor's biggest supporter for years. He adjusted his jacket and looked up at the stage with a cold stare. "Victor," the man said, his voice cutting through the noise. "That melody she played. The one you call The Storm. You told us you wrote that 10 years ago. You told us it was inspired by your own struggles." Victor swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing up and down. He gripped the microphone tighter, his knuckles white. I did write it," he stammered, but his voice lacked the confidence it had earlier. She stole it from me years ago. That is what I tried to tell everyone in court." The room erupted in disbelief. The people shook their heads. It was a lie that no one wanted to believe anymore. The emotion in Elena's performance had been too raw, too authentic. It was obvious to anyone with a heart that the music came from her soul, not his. Another woman stood up, shouting, "We heard you play your version just last month. It was technical, yes, but it was empty. Tonight we heard the real thing. You should be ashamed of yourself." Victor looked around the room, panic setting in. He searched for a friendly face, but everyone was looking away. Even the orchestra members were packing up their instruments, refusing to meet his eyes. He had built his career on respect and fear, and in a matter of minutes, Elena had stripped him of both. He was exposed as a fraud, standing alone on a stage that suddenly felt very, very big. By the next morning, the city was buzzing. It wasn't just the gossip columns in the newspapers, it was everywhere. On television screens in cafes, on radio stations during the morning commute, and especially on the internet. Someone in the audience had recorded the entire performance on their phone. The video had gone viral overnight. It wasn't just a local story anymore, millions of people had watched it. The video showed the moment Elena silenced the orchestra and began to play. The comments section was filled with praise. People were analyzing the music, talking about her technique, and debating the history of the dispute. But more than that, people were inspired by her bravery. They saw a woman who had been knocked down by someone more powerful, yet she stood up and fought back not with anger, but with art. She had become a hero to the little guy, to anyone who had ever been silenced by a bully. The Arts Council released a statement later that afternoon. It was short and to the point. They were launching an investigation into the origins of Victor's catalog of work and were putting his upcoming concerts on hold. The board of directors of the Music Academy, where Victor taught, announced that he would be taking a leave of absence. The walls were closing in on him. The lies he had told for so long were finally catching up to him, and he had no way to stop them. Elena, however, wasn't watching the news. She was sitting in her small, cozy apartment. It was a simple place, nothing like the luxury of the hotel she had left the night before, but it was hers. Sunlight was streaming through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. She sat in her favorite armchair, a cup of tea steaming gently on the table beside her. Her phone was ringing constantly on the kitchen counter. Agents, managers, old friends she hadn't heard from in years, they all wanted a piece of her. They wanted to offer her record deals, concert tours, and interviews. The world that had shut its doors on her 5 years ago was now beating down her door, begging her to come back in. She looked at her violin case resting against the wall. She walked over and opened it. The instrument looked beautiful in the morning light. She smiled at it, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. She picked up the bow and played a few notes, a soft, happy tune that had nothing to do with the drama of the past. She played just for the joy of it. Elena knew her life was going to change. She would probably go back to performing, and she would probably get the recognition she deserved. But for right now, she didn't care about the fame or the money. She didn't care about proving Victor wrong anymore. She had already won the only victory that mattered. She had reclaimed her dignity. She had stepped into the lion's den and walked out on her own terms. She had proved to herself that she didn't need their approval to be an artist. As long as she had her music, she would never truly be alone. She took a sip of her tea, listening to the quiet of her apartment, and for the first time in a long time, she felt completely at peace.